I swung that engine mount out. I had to take the ones out on this side, and then I couldn't swing it. I had to loosen the ones up on the other side. Just drop the pins back in, or the bolts back in on this side in case I have to take them out again. There's no point in putting the nuts on there until I get ready to button it down. Well, I slipped the muffler in there. There's a scat hose, 2-inch diameter, high temperature hose that goes between the muffler and the cabin heat. I've got to get that slid up on there, and that's always a pain in the butt. That thing doesn't want to slide on there very good sometimes. Well, what I have is some DC4, we call it Dow Corning 4. It's a silicone lubricant, the dielectric. We used it a lot in the Air Force on different things. It's for lubricating gaskets or O-rings. I used to use it when I was rebuilding regulators, first scuba diving regulators and stuff. I use that on O-rings and whatnot where you don't want to use a petroleum product on it. And it's slippery. I'll put that on the outlet off of that muffler and see if I can slide that tube on there. Those hoses, those scat hoses, have a spring wire wound in the inside of them to keep them from collapsing. That one's sticking out, so I've got to try to get it back down in there so I can get that outlet on there. Well, that went a lot easier than I expected. I'd hoped it'd go that easy. I had trouble before getting that lined up on there, especially in there where it's all jammed up against the firewall and you can't get around it. But when I polished that muffler and the shroud up, it had a pretty rough edge on it on that outlet tube on there, the aluminum outlet tube. And I polished that down and radiused it over with a little bit of the DC4 on there. That thing just slid right on there, so that was good. Now, I guess we'll see if I can pick that engine up and get it mounted on there. Looks like I'm going to have to take that one hose off the oil cooler. Alright, best laid plans. I'm going to have to reroute those lower spark plug cables around that engine mount, and I had to take off that one oil cooler hose because it was running into the engine mount, so I'm going to have to figure out what I'm going to do with that. Well, I got it up there. I got the top two, well, I got the bolts all started through the holes. I got nuts on the top two ones, and I got enough threads on those that I could lay that engine down without popping the threads off, without stripping the threads on it. But I got to looking at it, and there's a couple of things I got to change on there. I've got to redo those lower spark plug wires so they go down around that arm, that one arm on the engine mount on both sides. And then I've got to redo my primer line where I've got my T-block there on the primer line that comes right out on that lower engine mount there. So I'm going to have to drop that thing down and work on those things. Otherwise, it went on there pretty good this time without the interference of that lower oil cooler hose, but a couple little things to fix that you can't anticipate with it sitting on the ground without it being up there on the engine mount. I suppose I could have pulled that engine mount off of there and mounted it up to the engine, and I'd have known for sure, but I guess I could still do that. In fact, I might do that. Anyway, we got to lower that engine down and do a couple little things to it before we get any farther. I went ahead and pulled that engine mount off the firewall, off the airframe, mounted it up here on the engine. I had to make a few changes here. Of course, like I said, I had to take these lower spark plug wires off and reroute those as the way they would have been. They went over the top of this arm right here and got pinched in there and around that way, and they needed to come out and go around that. Same thing on this one, it got pinched here. I could have got it in between these two, but that wouldn't have been right either. It's better for them to hang down like this. So I redid those, and I redid the primer line. Now this primer line here was having a hard time getting that engine mount over this block right here. I thought I was going to have to move it back over in here, but when I did that, it didn't fit right in there either. So I brought it back out here where I had it. I just moved it around. Actually, I put the engine mount on first, and then I moved it around so that it's more square this way instead of kind of going in a diagonal right like this. And I had to redo this one primer line here that goes around, so I brought it out around that engine mount back over against the engine case over there, and then back up into the T. That's not too pretty, but it's better than it was. It was getting jammed up there in that little diagonal leg there on that engine mount. And I had to take this hose off. This is the lower oil hose for the oil cooler. I had to take it off to get it to fit in there, to get everything on there, because it is right here next to this lower engine mount bolt right here, the nut. I'll get the nut torqued down. This is those engine mounts here. The bolt goes in right through there. It's just exactly what came off of the other one. They're new rubbers though. They're new bushings in there. There we go, up here up on top. Oh, those get torqued down to 40 inch-pounds. There's also a squish. You measure the squish here. There's supposed to be like 1.84 inches between there, but that's kind of hard to measure on these upper ones here because I put the baffling on. If I hadn't put the baffling on, then we could measure it, but baffling's on there and I'm not taking it off, but I've been torquing them down to 40 pounds. These two on this side are torqued. These two here on the left side, I've been adjusting them a little bit because as that rubber squishes, then the torque loosens up on them, so I've just been gradually torquing them down. What that does it, that engine mount is mounted on there, so this thing's ready to go on the airplane now. I got those bolts torqued down now. The engine mount's all mounted up to the engine, and I got cotter pins in the bolts. So I'll go ahead and hoist that engine up there and see if I can get it on there now. Well, that didn't go quite as straightforward as I'd hoped it would, but it's up there. I had to take the engine mount off from the airframe and put it on the engine so I could route everything and get everything all cleared in there. And of course the chain hoist is not exactly straight up and down off the vertical line of the engine picking point, so I had to push against that. But getting the engine mount on there took a little bit of fiddling. It actually wasn't too bad. Usually I have to get some drift pins or something and run down in there through those holes to get them to line up, but I was able to get those to line up and get those bolts to drop right down in there. Like I said, a little fiddling around with it, but nothing too bad. That's good. I'm happy. I think I'm done for the day. Almost 7 o'clock now. So now I just got to go through and start hooking things up on it. Put the starter on and get the alternator on there tightened up and the belt adjusted on it. Hook the magnetos up. Put the carburetor on. Shoot, we're halfway on our way to a flying day. Well, I'm going to shut her down for the day, so I'm happy. I can sleep tonight. Now the engine is mounted up to the airframe there. Get the engine mount mounted up there. And the engine's all on there. You can see there's very little room here between the firewall and the engine. You get around to the behind the magnetos here, and this is a oil filter. That's the reason they make this engine mount so it swings out. So you can pull these bolts right here, this one here, and the one down here on the bottom. And then that engine mount can swing over so you can get better access to the back. Not a whole lot of room between the muffler there and either the firewall or the engine. This side's not quite so bad. The other side gets kind of busy. Let's take a trip over there and see what we've got over there. So this is the left side, and with this oil cooler mounted back here, makes it really tight over on this side. You've got the oil cooler hoses here, and of course the magneto is down in there. I still haven't put the breather tube in that comes out here and goes down, and then we got all the wiring and all of the controls for the engine, the throttle, mixture, and carburetor heat control. This is what I've got to work on here now, as I've got the cable here, the wiring here that goes. This is for the alternator wire. It goes into the main fuse box, the bus bar, and then this is the starter cable here, and then we've got all of the voltage regulator wires, and then this silver one here is the cylinder head temperature gauge wire goes to the probe. So I've got an 8L clamp here which will mount up to and clamp on the engine mount there to support this wire. And we've got it run underneath. There'll be another clamp here where it mounts into the engine mount again. And here is the probe for the cylinder head temperature that goes up into the one fitting that we mounted into the cylinder here. Now, a lot of them come with a ring that goes underneath as a gasket for the spark plug. And that's the most common one, but that takes a lot of abuse. Every time you change the spark plugs or take the spark plugs out to clean them or anything, that thing gets taken on and off there, so it gets a lot of abuse. So I'm going to clamp this wire bundle down to these bolts here that hold the sump on in a couple of spots, route that underneath the cylinders, and then it'll come out the front of the sump, and this wire cable will go to the starter, and then this one goes, these ones go over to the alternator here. And I've got to make sure everything is clear back in here. The spark plug leads here come down, and we've got the muffler right here. I've got to make sure everything clears. So that looks like the muffler will be down about there, so most of that stuff will clear there. I've got the copper line right here. This fitting goes over, attaches for the primer line, and then we got the carburetor heat cable. And we'll move back on up. I hooked the EGT probe wire up into the wiring harness where it goes into the airframe there. I still got to do something with it, tie it up. I've got this extra ground strap. I have to hook it somewhere. This goes to the airframe and to the engine. Make sure I have a good ground between everything, the engine and the airframe itself. We still have another ground wire over here that come off of this engine mount here that goes in too, and that goes into the engine mount. That should go to the airframe too, but because I've got so much paint on everything and grease, peralkatone and everything on all the nuts and bolts and hardware and everything, just to make sure I've got a good ground, I put an extra one on there. And then I have the magneto P-leads to hook up to the magnetos. I might have to swing the engine out to do that. And then we've got, let's see here, it's bouncing around in there. There's a tachometer cable that goes right there to that, where that orange plug is on there behind the oil filter. And then there is the oil temperature probe that goes in right here on the back side of the oil filter housing. And those are all long enough and set so that you can leave those hooked up if you swing the engine, because there's enough slack in there inside of the boot cowl that those can pull out with the engine when it swings. One of the things you have to be really careful with on this engine, swinging it over, it can't swing over near as far as it did. Normally the oil cooler is mounted to the front of the engine up there in the front, and so there's a lot more room here to turn this engine to swing it when you swing it out. But with this oil cooler on here, you have to be real careful. It doesn't swing over very far, runs into the boot cowl and the firewall, and I've seen those damaged. The firewall's damaged, and of course the oil cooler damaged from swinging that over too far. So I usually put a piece of foam rubber or something in there to keep that from damaging the oil filter or the boot cowl and the firewall when I swing that engine over.